Okay, it's the 10th of May, it's 5 p.m. and this is the Strategic Water Supply Assessment Working Session 2. And with that, I guess we don't need a roll call. Is that right?
That is correct. There's no need for a roll call.
Okay, great. Then so the first topic is Strategic Water Supply Assessment.
Ben, if you're trying to speak, your mute button's up.
Oh, no wonder. No one's listening to me. Can you move Paul over from the audience, Terry?
Sure.
You just got to tell him, Ben, snooze, you lose.
Well, he's kicking this off and it would fall to me otherwise, so.
Evening, folks. I guess better late than never. Are we ready to kick us off? Thanks, Terry.
Already kicked us off. We already kicked us off. You're online with the public.
Okay. Well, good evening. Paul Sellier, Director of Water Resources. Welcome to tonight is our second board working session on the Strategic Water Supply Assessment. Our first session was a couple weeks ago, April 26th, as you may recall, and the team gave a presentation that was sort of a detailed overview of the process that we're engaged in the Strategic Water Supply Assessment. And for folks that may be joining us that didn't get to attend that session, there is a recording of that available on our website. And of course, the presentation materials are there as well. But it's worth just noting that during that sort of detailed overview, a couple hours overview of this process, we touched on those goals around water supply, water quality, sustainability, and economics. If you remember, the team kind of gave us some information on how we were developing the drought scenarios and what information was going into that to help us understand, you know, how were we going to come up with what length and intensity of drought we should be planning for. And as that presentation continued, we walked through touched on really just the basic elements of the model, and noting that it's really not this magic black box that's going to tell us the answer to all our problems. It's a tool for us to use, akin to a calculator, to help us evaluate water management actions and what results they might provide for us. And speaking of water management actions, the team ran through a number of the water management alternatives, not in the great level of detail that we would all like to see already, but that's forthcoming in June. And just as a reminder, right, some of those water management alternatives included Sonoma-Marin partnerships. And within each of these alternatives, there were a couple different sort of variations on a theme. So with Sonoma-Marin, we were talking about winter water and using existing infrastructure, maybe an option that looked at dedicated conveyance, another option around regional groundwater banking. And we did also looked at other interties, and I think there were 4 of those talked about, including just one that we want to look at, and a quick look at it, maybe a connection to SFPUC. Water reuse, again, a number of options there around purple pipe projects, indirect, direct potable reuse, and so on. And of course, desalination and the different variations around desalination from local to regional. And then sort of the last couple water management actions we looked at were just very briefly touched on expanding local supply, not in any particular level of detail, but just noting that we do have a couple of reservoirs whose capacities are less than their average inflow. And so, that maybe makes them interesting candidates for us to look at that as an option. And those 2 reservoirs were sort of Nicasio and Sewell-Hooley. And we closed that session in terms of alternatives looking at demand management, which of course is sort of the focus of what we're doing in tonight's session, our second board working session. So to do that, we'll take a look at sort of demand first and just sort of define some terms around that before we step into some demand management. And I'll just take this opportunity to pull up the presentation. And as I'm doing that, I'd like to introduce the team as we kind of go through the overview. So Lucy Croy, the district's water quality manager, who sort of moonlights as water resources manager and does water resources for fun on the side, will be taking us through a review of system demand. And then kind of introducing us to this sort of sector by sector analysis of demand, looking at the different user types. And then we're very fortunate to be joined this evening by Peter Mayer of Water DM, who will take us through some very interesting and very specific data related to our water use in Marin in particular. Peter is a professional engineer and sort of one of America's foremost urban water experts. He's been in this field for over 25 years. His work is focused really on urban water management, water use research. He's prepared water demand analysis and management plans, integrated water resources plans, and even scenario analysis as well around water supply. And Peter has a number of customers that you may have heard of, including Metropolitan Water District, the City of Tucson, Colorado Water Conservation Board. I think New York features in there somewhere. So we're just very fortunate tonight and Peter is too, because of course he can now add Marin Municipal to his long list of clients.
I'm blushing, and it is a great honor. Actually, I was born just a few miles away in Oakland, so I actually have some historic connection.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And so Peter will hand off to Carrie Pollard, our water use efficiency manager, who will help us kind of make sense of the data that we've heard from Lucy and Peter and to point us to where some opportunities for savings might lie, before handing off to Armin Munevar with Jacobs, who will introduce scenarios to us and kind of help us understand that process a little bit before wrapping up and getting to next steps. So just before I hand off to Lucy, there's just sort of a little housekeeping for folks listening in. We do tend to use jargon in the industry and oftentimes without realizing it. So there are just some definitions that we've got here. And again, these slides are available on the website, so you can download them if you'd like to. But you'll hear terms like GPCD, which is gallons per capita per day, or another way of thinking about it is gallons per person per day. And then the definition is provided here is basically the total water use divided by population. And then I won't go through all of these, but they are here for reference. So at this point, I'll hand off to Lucy, who will walk us through system demands.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Good evening, Board of Directors. Lucy Croy, as Paul mentioned. You can move on to the next slide. So tonight, as Paul mentioned, we're focusing on demand management and water use in general. And looking back over the past 100 years or so, we see a few interesting trends and events shown here up on the screen. And of course, now I'm adding another jargon, which is production that wasn't shown on the past slide, but really production we see as another term that captures water demand or water use, as it's the amount of water that our treatment plants produce and really represents how much demand we have in the system. So at any given time. So it's a really good marker for understanding how much demand our customers have for water. And so as you can see here, through the early 1970s, we had a pretty marketed large increase in population growth, as well as water production use that really peaked kind of around 1975 or so. And then since that period or so, we've had some highs and lows that are really categorized through some major events. So through some droughts, and then also the recession of 2008 or so. And And so that's really what we've seen driving water use over a few periods. Is it's really an interesting chart to see, since the 1970s, where water use has been, with population staying pretty steady since 1970 and growing at a pretty low rate. So then taking just kind of a smaller snapshot of that same chart, this is now the running 12-month production, how much we produce from our treatment plants, and looking over a smaller time frame. So since the late 80s, the last 30 years or so. And really the focus of this chart is to look at some of these drought periods. So looking back in the late 80s, early 90s, we had a long drought during that period, and saw demand go from a high of 34,000, nearly 34,000 acre feet, down to a low of 22,000 acre feet over that period due to restrictions that were in place. Creep back up through the early 2000s, and then through the recession, and then also through the drought of 2013, 2015 or so, we've watched demand come back down. And as you'll see at the very tail end of this chart, just through April now, we're at 20,000 acre feet, a running 12-month number, which is the lowest that we've seen in over 30 years, which is quite incredible over that period now, with probably the most people we've had in quite some time. And it's really impressive to see the response we've seen from our customers during that drought period, that we're now down at this low running production number. So taking a step back, I'm noting some of the production numbers that have been shown on the last two slides, and that's really what's captured in this first line, so the baseline production. And this is really just an average of the last three. So 2018 to 2020 is what's captured here. So this is really more of an amount of water that we see vary throughout a period leading up to the drought. And then what we wanted to note going into this presentation is that there are a few other demands that we have on our system and our local reservoirs that we won't be focusing on tonight, but they do occur each year, and that is our environmental releases from two of our reservoirs, from Kent Lake and from Sewahuli Reservoir, which averages about 11,000 acre feet per year, and may vary given if it's a dry or a wet year. And then also evaporation from those reservoirs, our 7 local reservoirs, and the evaporation that occurs from having those surface reservoirs. So in total, about 41,000 acre feet in demand. So breaking down the potable production onto a monthly basis, this chart really shows the seasonal variation that we have. This is a chart that we've brought back that you may have seen a few years ago. And really what's to note here is the variation that we see between the winter months of January, February, where it may vary month to month and year to year, showing the last 5 years or so. But in January, February, we see typically around 1,500 acre feet or less of demand on a monthly basis. And then when it comes to July, August, our peak outdoor irrigation months, demand can jump up to nearly 3,000 acre feet. So nearly doubling during those peak irrigation months during that period. And shown here also on the purple, the last line in each month is 2021. And so you can see the decrease that was achieved last summer when the drought occurred and the policies were put in place to restrict outdoor irrigation, and the response that we had from our customers to really respond to the drought and decrease water use during those peak outdoor irrigation months. So now taking another look at demand, but breaking it down into sector by sector use or use type. We've got single family and multifamily up at the top, and then broken down into commercial, institutional, and landscape. So these are the main categories of use that we have within our system. And this is a table that comes from our urban water management plan from 2020. And so what's to note here is really the vast majority of our water use that goes to residential use. So it goes to single family and multifamily, shown here just in the first 2 lines. And then also down at the bottom line, showing that the totals, as I noted kind of in the first 2 historical charts, We saw the drought of 2013, 2015. It actually, our lowest demand hit in 2016. And then we've slowly been climbing up since then. So the peak reaching in 2020 with the pandemic, and then have had another drop since then with the drought. So just a few interesting demand numbers since then. So another way to look at the same chart, more numbers tonight, lots of numbers tonight. So this is the table, taking the table from the previous slide and then averaging those numbers. What we see is that over that 5-year period, demand has been around just under 25,000 acre feet per year. And as I noted, really single family and multifamily is the vast majority of our residential, of our water use. So residential use being 67%, the two of those sectors put together. And really, that's why it's one of the focuses for conservation savings in our programs. So now breaking down the sector use even more into indoor and outdoor use. You'll recall the monthly chart that we looked at before, in which January and February was very low at 1,500, and then it peaks at 3,000. That's typically how indoor and outdoor is estimated, taking that indoor use being half of or so of what that January use is, and then using that to understand, using the January use to estimate indoor use. So we would assume that no outdoor irrigation is occurring in January, February. And so that's where this indoor water use by sector estimation comes from. And so using that, we've come up with an estimation of around 12,000 acre feet sector by of the multifamily and single family. For residential is so the 12,000 acre feet is estimated indoor water use for residential.
Lucy, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
So I think that's a totally reasonable. I mean, I know that's the way they do it across the industry. Are you guys thinking, since you're really looking in here at very recent years, I think people, given the drought, I think people have been watering during the winter. That's certainly what we've been seeing. Are you guys accounting for that in some way?
Yes. So you're beating me to the punch.
Right, never mind. Sorry.
No, it's a good question. And it's a really good question, and something we've been asking ourselves even through the drought. So we'll have, Peter will be following up with more details on some of the data that we have available and the trends that we're seeing even through the winter months. So we'll be following that questioning. So moving on to the next, yes. So then taking the other half of the equation is outdoor water use. And so what we see there is, how much water use do we have in the outdoor, how much is available for water savings, and focusing in on kind of some of the major components. So single family we see as a large portion that we could go after, as well as the landscaping. So these are dedicated irrigation meters, as well as other, which includes our non-revenue water.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, because you went by that point super fast. I've had a bunch of people reach out to me. Can you just take a minute and explain that landscape number? I understand that there's dedicated landscape meters. I think that's been confusing for some members of the public. They're like, well, the landscaping water is actually really, really low. It looks like we've already separated out the landscaping. So if you could just take a minute to explain to the public why we have landscape separate from residential.
Yes, that's a good question. We have a number of meters throughout our system that are dedicated for irrigation. So we may have a multifamily meter that goes for indoor use, and then we have a meter that's separated just for irrigation to that multifamily building. And so it makes it easier to understand, what is the dedicated landscaping water use that it's much easier to understand how much water is being used for landscape. So that's why we've positioned this like this right here.
Lucy,
your question.
It may help, just other examples as well, like school fields and parks, these big dedicated irrigation customers.
Right. So that's why what you've got here is it's basically all of these different pieces need to be added up to get to what is actually outdoor use is.
Yes.
The idea. Okay.
So the total down at the bottom, the 11,530 would be the total for outdoor water use. And so what's circled is really just kind of the bigger sectors that we could see going after more like prioritizing and seeing opportunities for conservation savings.
Thanks.
So as I noted, I'll be handing off to Peter Mayer, who's going to build off this information and start talking about some of the data trends that we have available to us that is coming in from some new data that's available to us. So before I move on, I wanted to ask if there's any questions, or else I'm happy to hand off to Peter. Okay. I think all you, Peter.
All right, thanks very much, Lucy. It's a pleasure to be speaking to everyone tonight. And please feel free to ask questions as we go along. That's just fine. So next slide. Okay, so we're going to focus in now on single-family residential water use. And we're going to look at it in much more detail. And we can do that because we have these flume devices that are now installed in about 1,500, actually 1,700 homes across the Marin Water Service area. So this map on the screen shows where all the different devices are located, and the red star shows the location of the weather station that we've used to track the impacts of climate. The devices at each of these locations records the flow through the water meter every 5 seconds. That's very high resolution. And then what happens to that data is it gets sent up to the internet and then stored and then eventually analyzed. And because we have that ultra granularity, we can then disaggregate, essentially, break down the water use into indoor and outdoor, and then even within indoor into things like toilets and clothes washers and showers, to understand in much greater detail how much people are using for water. First is what is the volume of water that's being used for indoor and outdoor, and then also where they're using water and why maybe there's some differences. All right, next slide. So starting just looking at indoor use. So when we're looking at this is like the amount of water in gallons per capita per day, GPCD. It's the amount of water that a single person would use in their home during the day. And so what we have here is the average gallons per capita per day starting in July of 2021, and then the average for each month going all the way through March, quite recently, of 2022. And so you can see that there was some small fluctuations, but overall the average was 32 or 31 actually in the most recent quarter, 31.1 gallons per person per day, which historically would be extremely efficient. That's very low, especially to be measured across such a large population of 1,500 to 1,700 homes. So let's go to the next slide. So you think, well, maybe there's some people who are using like, 0 or something, but that's actually not what's going on. This shows the distribution of all of the days of indoor water use for each of these months and the range. And so the inner bars, the gray ones, are where 50% of the days lie, and then up to the 99th percent is to each of the final bars, and then you have just the 1% that might be above. So here you can see that really the central tendency pretty much across all of these customers is to use right around between 29 to 33, 34 gallons per person per day. So this efficiency really extends quite broadly and doesn't vary all that much. So if we then break it down, the indoor water use into the different components, and this is sort of what we call the pie chart. The blue, by the way, is low flow leaks. It's missed that label is missing, and it's about 5%. It's a little bit lower than clothes washers. And miscellaneous indoor includes faucet usage. But here, the dominating indoor uses of water are for toilets and for showers. And, you know, historically, we'd see a bigger slice of the pie for clothes washers. Clothes washers really do not constitute that big a chunk of the indoor demand anymore. So, you know, looking for savings, you have to really look towards toilets and showers and, you know, maybe faucets. But many faucet uses are actually discretionary, you know, filling up a pot with a fixed amount of water, things like that. There's some things that just are very difficult to influence there. So the other thing that we know is that the majority of the toilet flushes within the service area, like something like around 70%, are already efficient. So that the average toilet flush volume was 1.9 gallons per flush, and the median volume was 1.6. So 50% of the flush volumes, you know, of the and there's more than 2 million, 2.6 million toilet flushes measured across this data set. So it's extensive, but the median was 1.6 gallons per flush, which is the federally rated efficiency level, essentially, which means 50% of the flushes are below that, 50% are above that. So yeah, you could, you know, there's definitely still some older toilets. Those toilets will eventually be replaced. It is not, there's just no way they're going to last forever. There will be retrofits that occur naturally over time. You can incentivize and perhaps purchase those savings sooner. But given how efficient you already are, I think you have to question whether that's really worthwhile, since the majority of people are already, you know, quite efficient with toilets. So moving to outdoor use. So now we're switching from per capita to per household, because you know, on a per person basis, it's less meaningful, although it is useful when you want to look at like the relative importance.
Before we go outside, this is fascinating data.
Sure, absolutely.
Are you able to do anything about showers? Are you able to see, like, I mean, I don't know, I don't know how this would be, but like, are you able to see like how long, like,
yes,
the flow rate of a shower and how long showers are? Because this is
yes, yeah. I didn't. We chose not to get into the details too much, but we do have data on that, and we see quite low flow rates. We see actually quite short showers comparatively. I do not think that there is much there. You got to understand that 30 gallons per capita per day, what we're talking about, is really low. For comparison, like Phoenix, Arizona is at 52. So there, that, you know, that's kind of the range that you're seeing, and we'll show you some comparisons. Even your close neighbors are using quite a bit more indoors.
Peter, could I ask you a question on the toilet efficiency?
Sure, let's go back to that chart.
Yeah, thanks. So 1.6 is our median. I know Fairfax passed an ordinance actually at my suggestion, reducing replacement toilets to 1.28, which I think is the new standard. So
yeah,
that would be what, a third reduction?
Yes. So there's a couple of things. I didn't get into all of the nuances about this, but even at 5 seconds, what you're measuring with the toilet is actually the refill of the toilet. So, you know, you flush the toilet and then the water flows in, and that's what actually the device measures as the toilet refills. People also, if they wash their hands, would probably be doing it while that is occurring, and some of that faucet use might get included in these flush volumes. I think it's likely they're slightly elevated. So the actual toilet flush volume is probably closer, in the average is probably closer to 1.6. So you're already even lower than this. Now, the state of California does have a mandate for the WaterSense level toilet. So I mean, you could pass a local ordinance, but I don't think it would have much more effect than what's already in place, which is at 1.28 gallons per flush. So yeah, I mean, ultimately everybody is going to get down closer to 1.28 gallons per flush. The question that arises when you're thinking about planning, like you guys are, is it worth it to buy those savings sooner than they would occur naturally?
Okay, so that's the calculus that
yes.
you're kind of looking at. Okay.
I have a question too, Peter. This is a statistical evaluation by Flume, yes? I mean, they have reviewed data and they arrive at this by looking at the data, not by actually measuring these flows.
No,
And
this is
to that end,
direct. This is by direct measurement. Actually, it's
Well,
by direct measurement of the flows, breaking the 5-second data into like the individual toilet flush, calculating the statistics for that, and then determining that it's a toilet or something else based on those statistics and a machine learning process. So it really
how do
does
they know-
represent, yeah.
how do they know it's a toilet?
Well, so that is the disaggregation process. That's actually part of what I've worked on for most of my career. We started off doing a manual sort of a visual interpretation, and then advanced to a more traditional signal processing, where you can basically recognize things by their flow rate, and the toilet always flushes similarly. But now Flume has advanced it with the machine learning, and essentially you develop a data set of known water use events, and then you're able to apply it across the population. It's extremely accurate.
And what error do you think is in this data?
It's difficult to say, but I've followed the trends in demand, and I'm seeing comparisons. We're now looking at data across hundreds of thousands of homes. I don't think there is a great deal of error in the disaggregation of indoor and outdoor use. And then once you're in indoor use, or maybe there's a percent that should have been in faucets, or maybe there's some leakage that's included in toilets or something like that. But that you're at 30 gallons per capita per day indoors is I think indisputable.
And one more
other
question.
Oh, go ahead.
I have one more. We also have 2,800 AMI meters in addition to the 1,700. Is there a way to incorporate more data than we currently have?
Certainly, you can always incorporate more data. That's not wouldn't necessarily be something that I would do, but that could definitely be done. One thing that we did do, just to let people know, is we took last year we looked at the water use from the people who had Flume devices, and we used their billing data and compared it with the population. And we could see that over the winter months, their use was quite similar to the population. During the summer months, it was a little bit higher. So our sense is that this group of 1,700 homes is quite similar, at least for how they're using water through the indoor period, the winter period, which is predominantly indoor, than they do use a little bit more outdoor, and perhaps from having more landscape use.
Does that also mean they may be more sensitive to the pricing, that they're worried about their water bills? That's why
I think they may skew wealthier. I think they may skew wealthier too, which may mean that they're less sensitive to pricing. But that's a pretty complicated question.
Just one other quick question, Peter, on the total volume, 5,060,000. Is that daily?
No. That's like if you add up every toilet flush that we measured of the 2.6 million toilet flushes that were recorded during this data period, all of them together totaled 5 million gallons. That's not very, very useful number, I will confess.
Okay.
It's an impressive number all the same. Do you think, is there, and I can't personally see any challenge with it, but is there anything about COVID and the way that people have been home far more often? Is there anything about the data, because you do span over time, do you see any issues with, because COVID is a hopefully, I'm sure we all feel this way, is a rare event, that where we are not, the patterns of a year ago or 2 years ago might not be the patterns we see going forward. I'm just wondering if there's anything about the data that we should be thoughtful about, knowing that it might have been collected during a rare time.
Well, actually, water use has essentially returned to lower than pre-COVID levels pretty much across the country. And we've been reporting on the national water use from every quarter with a flume index, which actually anybody can attend these quarterly webinars. And so we've been tracking water use through the pandemic. There's an amazing spike that occurs during the lockdown period in February of 2020. And then it just kind of gradually comes down. And now almost in every city where we're able to have sufficient flume devices we're seeing indoor per capita use lower than it was before the pandemic.
Peter, what did you say the time period for this was, this data?
What I was just talking about covered the period from 2019 all the way through 2022. What we're going to look at tonight, though, is just from the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022, which I think is the most relevant. Now, it is drought impacted still. I mean, you're clearly, you know, there especially in outdoor use, there's tremendous, you know, reduction that occurred. But you know, and so let's talk about outdoor use. Then we can think about bounce back. You know, Carrie's going to talk a little bit about what you guys can expect on bounce back. You know, I think you'll get a little bit of bounce back on indoor, but I think most of the savings that we've seen in indoor are probably baked in from reductions in toilets, changes to actual fixtures and appliances. All right, let's switch to outdoor. So outdoor use, we look at gallons per household per day rather than per capita. And we're looking at, monthly average. So at the height of the summer last year, when there was drought restrictions in place across these 1,700 homes, the average was 144 gallons per household per day. I think the most interesting thing might be what happens in December and January in those winter months, that when there's still around 20 gallons per household per day on average of outdoor use. And then you can see it slowly climbing up through the beginning of 2022 up to where we are at 65, and I would expect April will be considerably higher. So one of the things that when a person installs a flume, and flume is a device that you can buy on Amazon for $200, and it's been incentivized by Marin Water, so people get a rebate for it. So when you install it on the water meter and then you're setting it up with the app, they ask you a few questions. One of the questions is how many people live in your house. That's how we are able to calculate the gallons per capita per day. Another of the questions is what is the predominant form of irrigation or watering at your house? And they are given a choice: a sprinkler system, drip, garden hose, or none. Now they might have multiple of these things, but by and large this is we think to be pretty good estimate of what is the dominant form of irrigation. And then here is outdoor water use, gallons per household per day, for all of the households, just the average use for all the households that indicated these different things. And so you can see that having a sprinkler system really is an indicator of having higher outdoor water use. And even it's an indicator of having higher outdoor water use through the winter months. The people with drip are not that far off. They may also have some sprinkler components to their irrigation, but they're dominant in having more drip. But they drop down pretty close during the winter months to what you see for the people who say they have nothing or just use a garden hose, whereas the red line stays up above. So, if you're looking for outdoor savings, again, I think you're going to be, by and large, focusing on people who have sprinkler systems, which was only about 27% of the respondents in the sample, which is quite a small number. The drip people were like almost 60% of the respondents. So you already have a majority of these single-family customers using drip. So there's less to squeeze there with that information.
Can I ask you quickly about that? Because there you're really getting into who has a flume, and that's primarily in Belvedere and Tiburon, right? They're not evenly distributed. So how comfortable do you feel with? It seems that you're saying we should assume that that's district wide. How comfortable do you feel with that assumption?
I'm not saying that necessarily you assume outdoor. I mean, what we know about these houses actually use more water outdoors.
No, I'm aware.
I mean, I think these probably are more indicative of the people who you would need to go after if you want to get future water savings.
I think that's right. I'm sort of making a different point, which is you're saying there's only 27% of them, right, that are using, this technology, the high water use technology, right? On the one hand, they're probably high water users because they're more wealthy. On the other hand, I'm not sure that low percentage is indicative of the district, overall, especially since this is more southern Marin, right?
Well, did you see the map at the beginning? They're pretty well spread. Maybe we could jump back there real quick.
Maybe so. I had thought this was.
See, look where you see. I mean, they're all over the place now.
Well, I wonder though, it's still the people who signed up for a Flume device are, I think, in and of themselves, a certain type of person who's already interested in being aware of water use. So I would say if there's probably a skewing of the data, I would say that the people who've taken the time to install drip are probably the kind of people who would purchase a Flume device, and the opposite being true, that people who aren't updating their irrigation systems aren't also spending money on Flume devices. But maybe our AMI data, which is not discretionary, might show an important difference if we were trying to tease that out further.
Yeah.
That is a very good idea. If we could have some correlation between the two, it would be very revealing.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe that I was a little confused because typically when we look at the Flume data, for some reason, we're generally shown these charts from Tiburon and Belvedere. So so it's fine.
There's a lot more units than there used to be.
That's AMI. AMI is Belvedere and Tiburon, not Flume.
I would expect the Flume to be less there because they have AMI.
Oh, okay. All right. So all right. That's helpful.
The other thing is, I don't think the AMI customers fill out that data form that distinguishes or that calls out, specifies their uses, which seems pretty critical to this analysis, is the self-reporting.
They don't, Larry, but it seems to me that might make sense to pick a representative number, Ben, to install Flumes where there are AMI and get this cross-linked done. It may already be that way. I don't know. There may be people that have both.
Yeah, I think looking at it, we can kind of go back with the team and huddle a little bit to respond to some of these questions. There's a lot of good ideas, including that one.
Okay, so finally, what we're going to look at is a comparison, sort of get an idea of, well, how do indoor and outdoor use compare with each other? So this is, again, gallons per capita per day, not the best way to look at outdoor use, but it is useful to look at it in the context with indoor use. So the orange line is indoor use, average indoor use for each month. And then the blue line is the average outdoor use for each month. And then the yellow line is the combination. You add essentially the blue and the orange, and you get the yellow line. So you can see that in the summer months, outdoor use is absolutely higher than indoor use. But during the winter months, indoor use is the dominant factor, and even all the way into the spring. So a good chunk of the year. Outdoor use is considerably less of a factor. So let's finally look at some comparisons. And this is some comparisons with what are already some highly efficient agencies. So the Marin is in red here, and this is for 3 quarters, Q3, Q4 of 21, and then Q1 of 22. And this is indoor gallons per capita per day. And so the only place really consistently more efficient are the 35 homes in Inverness that have Flume. The places that are really more comparable where there's a lot of Flumes are places like Eby Mud, Contra Costa Water District in pink, Santa Barbara, where there's hundreds and hundreds, and it's a much more, I think, reasonable comparison. So, you can see that Marin is consistently lower than those communities in the average indoor gallons per capita per day. And this really is what I view to be an apples to apples comparison, because they're all collected from the flume sites at these different communities.
And just to be clear, this is just for this past year that we're looking at.
Well, you could just see the dates, right? It's right there. It's Q3 of 2021, Q4
Right, okay.
of 20. So it's the most recent period.
Mm-hmm. And you feel that that's indicative of that's the, I mean, it's just, we were looking at a chart the other day that was more showing showing water use over time. So it's just interesting that you're focused in on this narrow period.
Well, it's 9 months. It's the
It's 9 months.
I think the point is to try to establish, how much more could you reasonably expect us to expect for water efficiency?
No, I understand. What I'm saying is it's just interesting to me that you're focusing on this 9-month period. I mean, it's fascinating data for sure, but I think we've heard a lot, well, it could bounce back. And, I mean,
we're focusing on the most recent data, and certainly we'll be tracking it. I mean, we'll be able to measure any bounce back that occurs. We have a remarkable way of tracking demand real time at this point. I mean, I think it makes sense to focus on the most current data that you have. I mean, what does the demand of a year or two ago have anything to do with what it's likely to be next year at this point?
Well, that's a great question, but the answer is that we made a tremendous effort this last year, and some of this is about sort of more short-term, I would imagine, is short-term behavior changes. And some will be, as you've said, a matter of people having invested in fixtures or, changing out their turf or whatever it is. But we don't really know that yet, do we?
Well, we know the flushes per person per day isn't very different. We just know that the toilet volumes are lower.
Okay.
I think the other thing we know is that we are now providing some data to the individuals, so that they have more knowledge than they had waiting for 60 days to get a bill. So there's a feed forward or feedback, depending on how you look at it, information source coming to them that they never had before.
Right. I think the most significant thing is that you are under drought restrictions when these data were taken.
Sure.
And none of these other places were nearly to the same degree.
You don't think the other places were under drought restrictions during the drought? I'm not sure.
In Q3 of last year, not to the same degree that was declared.
No.
It's some of them similarly, but not the same way that you had with your restrictions and your messaging.
So wouldn't you?
They're going to be.
Wouldn't you expect? I think that's where I'm struggling a little bit with.
I do expect outdoor use especially is lower, and we've mentioned that, and we showed that in the data that Lucy showed. How much water use was down in 2021, and that with the purple bars versus the other bars.
So doesn't this really show that the drought restrictions were effective?
Well, I think you've measured the effect of the drought restrictions. What was the percent reduction that was ultimately achieved?
24 or something like that, Peter, I think. Director Kohler, I think you do raise an important point, and we are going to touch on it later. We're trying not to take this data in sort of isolation and make all our plans on that basis, I think is your point. So yeah, we're tracking with you completely. So
okay.
Carrie's going to step in a minute and help us kind of get a little bit of a handle on that. But it's a tough question to answer, and let's see where we go with it.
Sure thing.
Okay, so Peter.
Thanks. Okay, so I think we're getting at the end here. So this is outdoor use, gallons per household per day for each of these quarters, and so during the third quarter of July, which is essentially July and the end of the summer last year, and that's when Marin had essentially a ban or close to it. On outdoor water use, you're using about half as much as EB Mud and the homes in Contra Costa. Still some though. And then over the winter time, it dropped considerably lower, but not as low as these two smaller communities, Cambria and Inverness. Also, very few flumes, though, comparatively. I'm a little bit, I would not rely on those as much.
Great.
So I'm going to turn it over to Carrie, unless there are any other questions, and she's going to focus on the opportunities for savings.
I'd just like to say thank you, Peter, on behalf of the board and the Water District. That was a great presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, thanks, Peter. So this new data, and there's a lot of it, right? We only got kind of just an overview. It can help us increase our understanding of how our water is used within the service area, specifically around our single family customers. And as Lucy mentioned, residential water use is it dominates it's the sector that uses the most water within the service area. So we learned about this idea of indoor versus outdoor water use, and kind of what the breakdown could possibly be in this flume data, and this new data set could really help inform how we look at those percentages of indoor and outdoor. It also can help us understand fixture saturation, right? So we could acknowledge during the drought, folks were making behavioral changes to reduce their water use, but the efficiency of the fixtures from this data set really shows that those may be close to, where we want them to be, and the remaining amount could be captured through natural replacement. And so, we took a snapshot of toilets, but there's, every fixture that was on that pie chart, we have that level of data for, and we'll continue to dive into that and go through it. So what we did here is we took the chart that Lucy showed earlier of our 2020 water use by sector, and we adjusted the single family line item, acknowledging that some water use during the winter is going towards irrigation, or would be considered outdoor water use. And we used the percentage that we were able to gather from the flume data to do this. And so, potentially this would be something that we could carry forward, and staff is really evaluating whether or not this makes sense. But we did want to show this because we do use this data to feed into the additional analysis that we'll walk through. Next slide. So that was the indoor section. So this is the outdoor. And so this did increase the single family outdoor bucket, if you would. And you may think, well, does this really make sense? We were in a drought. Does adding, increasing this outdoor use by 22%, makes sense. But if there was ever a time where our customers would have hopefully turned their irrigation systems off, it was coming out of a historic drought. And we could still see outdoor water use at over 20%. And so, hopefully this can help inform, as we move forward, what makes sense for the breakdown of indoor versus outdoor. Next slide. So I want to kind of take this a step further and look at a summary of the residential use, right? So the top two bullets are really pulling in that flume data set. So what we're calling current is really, as Peter noted, the last couple of quarters of indoor use of our residential gallons per person per day at about 32. Incredibly efficient. And, noting that was, during drought years and drought months, as part of our water shortage emergency actions were in place. We also have our outdoor breakdown there in gallons per household per day. So different metric of 53. So those are, fairly short time periods, 9 months or so. We also wanted to look at, well, what for the entire year of 2021, we have our production data and we know how much water was delivered to our residential customers. So in 2021, what was our RGPCD? It was 71, right? So that's kind of one bookend. We know demand was very low during that time period. The other end of the bookend would be our pre-drought 2020, which when we look at our most recent years, 2020 had higher water use than we had seen. Lucy mentioned that water use had been creeping up since about 2016, and 2020 was really where it peaked. And that at that point, our residential customers were at about 85 gallons per person per day. And so, recognizing that the flume data was collected as part of the water shortage emergency, and we now have these bookends we can look at. What is the likely rebound, right? Indoor savings would probably show some rebound because of the behavioral changes and the behavioral actions our customers took during the drought. but it's probably unlikely to rebound up to the 85 that we saw during pre-drought. You know, again, the data Lucy showed earlier that shows this peaks and valleys of demand over years, you know, you look at the years post-drought, there was always a rebound, but it rarely went back to that same level that we saw prior to that drought occurrence. So we can expect some indoor rebound. Outdoor, though, we think it's more likely to return to close to pre-drought levels, right? We'll get some carryover savings from customers who did change their landscapes. And we've looked at that in the past, and we have a slide on that in a few moments. But we can anticipate that you know, outdoor will rebound more so. So next slide. So we wanted to look at, you know, what's the potential, right? Not just focusing on single family, our single family customers, acknowledging that there could be savings potential across all the sectors within the district. So as I mentioned, for single family indoor, it's very similar to multifamily customers, right? We feel that that's fairly limited opportunity for savings. We look at outdoor for our residential customers. We think that focusing in on programs like our turf replacement programs and leaning on technologies and other efficiencies to reduce outdoor demand will be key to achieve additional savings. That landscape category is back again, right? Our dedicated irrigation meter customers, also often referred to as our large landscape customers, right? Schools, parks, and such. We feel that there's opportunities for savings, recognizing that you know, they won't be able to just convert to low water use plants, right? But there are some new turf grass varieties that are very low, and so maybe, you know, that's an opportunity to get them. Okay, they can maintain the turf, but a different variety that uses much less water. Another opportunity for those large landscape customers will be the irrigation efficiencies. So, you know, whether it's smart irrigation controllers or new technologies that are launched and available to increase the efficiency would help get savings there. And finally, closing out this category with education, right? The folks who maintain these landscapes have a lot of influence on how much water is being applied, right? So it's the maintenance of the system and also the adjusting of their irrigation controllers, right? The repairing of leaks and all of that stuff. And so acknowledging that education will be key to achieving landscape saving, this landscape category, dedicated irrigation meter savings. The other category, which includes system losses. So that would be, you know, looking at not only leakage, but meter accuracy and, you know, unbilled customers and all, you know, that all that non-revenue water will be an opportunity as well. And then finally, our industrial and commercial customers feel that there's largely indoor savings because most of their landscaping will be covered in that dedicated irrigation meter category. But I think it's going to be more sector specific. For example, even specific sectors of commercial, right? So for example, restaurants, right? We think, well, we've replaced many of the pre-rinse spray valves and dishwashers in these types of, you know, restaurants. But there's dipper wells, which is, you know, constantly having water run through them. There's steam cookers. There's a lot of other kind of technologies that continue to evolve that I think we can leverage some opportunities from. And so what we wanted to do is, the next slide, what we wanted to do is not just provide kind of some, you know, words around what we might be looking at, but actually kind of provide some savings numbers that are being considered. So starting with our indoor water saving opportunities, we have our single family and multifamily sector looking at up to, you know, 35 and 12 acre feet per year respectively. Again, these are annual savings by indoor, and the next slide is outdoor. So if you know, look at the total down there of 52 acre feet per year, that would be, you know, 52 acre feet in 1 year. And then if you look 10 years out, that becomes, you know, 520. So we did want to provide a range on these estimates just to reflect that there is a level of uncertainty, right? We acknowledge there's potential, but there's also a level of uncertainty. And that level of uncertainty really comes into play because it requires our customers to engage with us, right? To be willing and able to make these changes, either through our incentives or through, you know, willing to let go of that really old toilet that's probably pink and that's why they keep it because they can't find another pink toilet. But to really achieve those savings. And so that's acknowledged here as well. Next slide. So then when we look at our outdoor annual water savings potential, we know that the single family residential outdoor component is really, you know, that's our biggest user, therefore our biggest opportunity for savings. And I mentioned that during the water shortage emergency, we had, you know, a really high level of enthusiasm in our turf replacement program. And there's questions of, you know, will we be able to maintain that same level of participation? And then that's why we have the range for savings for turf replacement from as low as 10 acre feet per year and up to 40, again, acre feet per year. So think about this maybe 10 years out, this could be quite significant. We also acknowledge that, you know, not only focusing on turf replacement for our single family customers, but there's other opportunities, whether, you know, installation of drip or conversion from overhead spray to drip, and, you know, technologies like smart controllers, et cetera, could get us some additional savings, which are listed there. And then when we look at a range of reductions for our large landscape customers, we wanted to provide, you know, acknowledge that there's, again, mostly on that education front and maybe the technology front to achieve those savings, and losses will be something we continue to look at as well as we've assigned a range of savings there. Total annual outdoor water use savings would be up to about 74 acre feet per year. Again, you know, so we thought about this 10 years out, it'd be at 740 acre feet in total, which is significant, right, in comparison to our total water use that we're delivering.
Can I just ask you about that? Because that's a really interesting set of assumptions. I mean, so you think that at the highest end, we're unlikely to even save 10% of our outdoor water use. I mean,
think that's
surprising to me. It would be good for you to unpack the data supporting that, because that is surprising to me based on what we're seeing in other parts of the country.
Yeah, I think that
And
when we look at
speak to that, because that does seem strange.
Yeah,
I mean, I want you to speak to it. I'm just saying, I'm just surprised.
Yeah, so I think what we wanted to do, I think part of the task at hand here was to acknowledge where are there opportunities and where can we focus in on to get them, right? And not shooting so far out that it's completely unrealistic, right? We wanted to balance the potential and that level of uncertainty. And so looking at you, and you're right, it is 10%, right? So we look at, you know, could we achieve this fairly, you know, is this actually attainable? Yes. And we think that it is. And yeah, so maybe if Peter wants to speak to.
It's not even 10%. It's not even 1%, if I'm doing my math right. I mean, outdoor use is 8,200, and you're talking about 74 at the highest end.
Per right, over the course of multiple years, right? So you do 74 this year, you get that 74 this year and next year, right? So it does kind of.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I see. I'm sorry, I was confused because it says total. All right. So you think that every year we'd be unlikely. So you're saying an average. You're saying at the high end, we could expect less than 1%, and it would take us 10 years to get to 10% savings on outdoor water use.
For a realistic and attainable program that is not necessarily super aggressive, but out there and doing good work, then yeah, I think 10% is reasonable. And I do invite Peter to speak to this. You know, he is
let's just to be clear, it's not 10%, it's 1% per year
over the course of 10 years.
And not getting.
You're right, Cynthia. You're right.
10 years.
It's 1%.
Yeah. So let's just be super clear, because that does seem a little. I mean, obviously, Carrie, we all want to be realistic. I'm just saying there's realistic and there's also overly conservative. So I think here's where I think would be useful for the board and the public to have some data about what's happened in other communities. Because I mean, if we're saying we're simply not going to make it's a little bit cart before the horse, right? I mean, are we willing to make the investments, or are we just saying we can't make the investments, so this is what's realistic?
I think that is really the question at hand. And I think this was intended to kind of show one of the scenarios that would go into that is, you know, Armin will speak to in a moment, that will be part of the process that for consideration of this, you know, water supply assessment. But we didn't want to not show any numbers tonight, right? We wanted to at least kind of frame how we're starting to think about the potential and where there might be opportunities and what's realistic. And, you know, and you're right, you know, the higher level of investment may result in additional savings, but I think even that may have a threshold, right?
It all has a threshold. I'm just saying we're not without data. There's lots of communities now across the West and in California that are investing in outdoor programs. So I mean, I don't have that data at my fingertips. I expect Peter, who is an expert in this, probably does.
Outdoor water savings are entirely dependent on where you start from. And you guys are starting from an extremely low level of outdoor water use. So one of the things you need to think about is, what does the future landscape in your service area look like, and how much water does that landscape need? Because you could drive down, theoretically you could drive down demand, through a variety of different mechanisms. But would that achieve then what you want, for your community, in terms of shading or quality of life? Because that will become an important question to think about as you push further. I think these are very realistic, in terms of what you could reasonably achieve, given that the sponge has already been squeezed considerably.
Outdoor water use, I have to say, I can't really agree with you. I mean, these numbers are from an extreme drought. So I'm just saying that's not where we have been for the last 10, 20 years. I mean, you're sort of basing that as if the extreme drought is the baseline. And I'm not sure why that would be the assumption. Even
before the drought, your outdoor water use was not extremely high, compared to, let's say, Southern California. I mean, if you look at your typical single family water use, again, you end up making policy decisions, though, about what the landscape might look like, by deciding how much will be available. That's just important thing to think about.
This is, and I want to jump in here because I know this is a topic around which we often, I think, can get confused, because so I just, and whether what I'm about to say is going to bring clarity or create confusion, forgive me if it's the latter. So when we use, the number that's represented here, the 8252, that is based on recent water use, which is when we have had restriction. In my mind, right, maybe right or wrong, is some of the most restrictive use we've seen in our history, because we not only had all the outdoor efficiency water use gains of the past decades, as people have gotten more onto drip and so forth, but then we also instituted restrictions that further limited water use. So if that's the case, I don't think the 8252 reflects what would be the average norm, not in a dry year scenario. And I think that's an important thing to have a number that doesn't reflect restrictions, because that's, I think, more the norm. How this influences the results where we only get a 1% water savings, I think that essentially, in a way, you're saying, right, if we maintained all the restrictions that are in place and nobody improved their, and we were at our current water technology that's out in our communities, we might have that low, in order to get these additional savings in an average year, it might be, our potential might be that low. But I think that part of the total annual outdoor water use savings, the number is so small because we're using a very restrictive 8252, which reflects not what I think is the norm of what water use would be in an average situation.
Yeah, I think Monty and I are saying exactly the same thing. And I think, I'm certainly going to agree with Peter that there's going to be, a drought shadow, right? That's very, very standard. We've seen that for many years, but it seems that I'm just interested in the data suggesting that the drought shadow is going to be that's extreme.
If I could, Director Kohler, just to clarify, the 8252 is actually taken from 2020, which, as you recall, is a high water use year.
I'm sorry, I thought Peter's, not to interrupt, but I mean, it's just been a lot of numbers, Paul. So yeah. Peter's data, we talked a lot about this, was from the last 9 months. Is this a different number?
Yeah, this was Carrie started off we took the Urban Water Management Plan 2020 data and adjusted it using the flume data right, the original 2020 urban water management plan data had assumed all indoor water use, what was just all of January, and right, so that was how they determined indoor water use. And what we saw from the flume data was that in fact during winter some of that water was used outside. So recognizing that's only 1 year of flume, we
Yeah.
just wanted to kind of throw out the notion that maybe we could adjust the indoor water use to and corresponding outdoor water use. So there's an increase here in outdoor water use that's basically taking some of that indoor water use.
Got it. So
Yeah.
I guess then the question is, does that number, because the number just kind of without context, it's not clear to me that that is, I mean, I guess, I think what's surprising to me is this conclusion, which is we can't possibly do very much better on outdoor water use. I mean, considering how very many people have not changed out their turf, are still using, non-drip irrigation. It seems a surprising conclusion. It seems a very conservative conclusion that there's almost nothing we can do to improve water use efficiency in outdoor residential water use. So I'm just looking for that to get unpacked, because we're going back and forth between these numbers. So I'm hearing Peter say on the one hand, oh my God, we're like more efficient than anybody. But then I'm hearing, well, this number actually reflects a high water year. So it's just,
It reflects a high water year because that's exactly what you were asking for, and the proper way to do it,
Right.
for trying to assess, what you might achieve in the future. We use a high water year here so that assuming the bounce back occurs, so
Right.
then you can say, okay, what could we realistically then achieve? The reason I think that I pushed back too a little bit when I first saw these water savings too, and Ben pointed out that you guys had a full ban on outdoor water use, and you just didn't get the response that you expected. Water use is lower, but it wasn't quite the full reduction that was anticipated. So that's given us some pause about what might really be achievable.
But that's a matter of a lot of different factors, right? And you know that better than anybody. That's how much money we spend, how much staff we put in place, how much effort we put into promoting. I mean, I'm just saying there's a lot of data from other communities who have done, for example, turf changeout programs and using various controllers and all of the tech that's available now. And I don't know that there's much out there to support the assumption that we are a very efficient community. I mean, your numbers on the drought, that's impressive. I think that showed that our water use restrictions were effective, very effective. But I don't see the data supporting that 1%. First of all, I don't see the data indicating that in a normal year, without those drought restrictions, we're particularly more efficient than other communities that have made similar sorts of efforts. The question is, and the assumption that we can't possibly get, or almost not any more efficient at all, I'm not seeing the data for that here. This seems to be based on many, many assumptions that I'm not seeing how this compares to data in other communities that have actually put investment into these programs.
So
They have much
Director
higher
Fuller-
water use than you do. Like a place like Las Vegas has much higher outdoor water use.
Yeah,
I'm not
it's the
sure that's
climate.
more.
It's the climate.
I would,
The other just comment or discussion point is, do we as a district want to distinguish reasonable or arguably somewhat conservative projections for demand reduction in context of a water supply planning effort where if you're wrong, there's pretty significant consequences to the community? Distinguish that effort from an ambitious conservation program that we do invest more in, and we do anticipate or hope that we get significant more savings than this. So part of it is the context of this discussion is a water supply planning effort.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think that that's really important because I feel like what we did ask is to give a projection like this. So thank you for the people who had the guts and to stick their neck out and throw some numbers that were going to get shot at. You're wrong, and we knew you were going to be wrong, and you were wrong before you even started, because that's just what happens modeling and numbers. So thank you. I don't mean to at all joke about what you produce. This is really helpful. It's giving us really good room for thought. And I think what we did ask for is a projection of what we might expect for conservation with a modest effort, not a robust over the top effort or anything really, frankly, you know, other than maybe just what we might do otherwise or have done in the past, as a way of saying if we did status quo, and then the numbers might and should look different if we made a more robust effort, which I think is what Ben, you were saying. So, you know, if this is what reflects the status quo, then so be it. You know, it says, but okay.
Can we just clarify that, Monty? Does this reflect the status quo, Carrie?
This this would assume, you know, a level of continued turf replacement program. So yeah, I mean, it would be like all the programs we essentially have in place today would remain. And actually, it actually factors in, you know, a lot relying on natural replacement for indoor savings.
Right. I'm just saying the outdoor. So obviously the, you know, passive conservation is important, is going to happen, but the idea that we would really not even see a 1% annual increase in efficiency, is that based on the proposed level of turf? I'm just picking on turf because it's the biggest opportunity on the residential side, and it's the program that I think we've got the most money in. Does this assume, I think the proposal is for about 300,000 a year or 500,000 a year. That's the level that this is assuming?
Well, this looks at the water savings, right? Whether we invest $3 a year or you know, $1.50 a year, sorry, a square foot.
Okay.
Right? The resulting savings are exactly the same, right? So if we have the water savings are the same per square foot. They absolutely are. And so during the water shortage emergency, when we had such a high level of enthusiasm in our program, and we were able to achieve a 35 acre feet per year reduction just from those participants who have already gone through the program, right? And so that's why the range is 10 to 40. So that high range does assume that high level of participation within that turf replacement program.
Well, I think the range is probably, and again, Peter can speak to this more than I can, but I believe there's a fairly strong correlation between what the districts are investing, whether it's $1 or $3 a square foot. And even that is meaningless if you're only investing up to a certain amount of money, right? I mean, if you're limiting your investment to $300,000 or $500,000 total per year, as opposed to what we spent last year, which was $2 million, you're going to get a different result. I think that's a fair assumption.
Well, you might attract more people to participate for sure. But I think Carrie's point was that you wouldn't save any more water per square foot by paying more for it.
But this is a
yield of acres.
This is a yield number, right? So if you invest more, you're going to have more savings, right? Are we
with
not?
The diminishing curve, though? Remember, it doesn't like go up linearly.
We have barely done any turf programs at all. We had a 9-month turf program. So the idea that we have nowhere to go on turf, I don't understand that as an assumption. We've literally had a program for 9 months. And the assumption that we have nowhere to go, we're so efficient that we can't possibly save anymore. I just don't understand the data to support that.
I don't think this is nowhere to go. I mean, this is assuming the same level of savings that you were getting under the drought circumstances. And that level of investment and you know, public awareness, I think you're going to have a hard time, frankly, maintaining that level of public awareness and interest of the program without a drought.
Well, okay. So if I could just finish, Larry, I mean, what I'm saying is, first of all, as you know better, again, than any of us, these programs take time, right? People don't turn on a dime and say, oh, it's a drought, I'm going to change out my lawn, right? My understanding of the literature is that it takes a lot of time for these programs to get into place. You know, not everybody is an early adapter. So what we've seen in Las Vegas has been 25 years. And I mean, they've seen growth over time. It's not as though they've had plenty of droughts in that period. And my understanding from Doug Bennett and others there is they do see, periods, where it goes up and down. But I mean, they've literally invested tens of millions of dollars very effectively. And I'm certainly not saying we want to be Las Vegas or we should turn Marin into Las Vegas. And we certainly couldn't, because that's not our climate and that's not where anybody wants to go. But I mean, they have made a concerted investment over a long period of time. And they have not found, oh, year one was the only year where we really saw savings. To the contrary, what they have found is that as the program has grown, as people have gotten used to it, as people have learned about it, more and more people have gotten interested in it. Doesn't that resonate with your experience?
Was that a question for me?
It was.
Yes.
Oh, well, so first of all, Las Vegas doesn't have drought. They
Well,
do
they
not
have,
declare drought restrictions.
Right.
They have permanent watering restrictions.
right.
And
right.
then they have things like you're not allowed to have a front lawn in Las Vegas. They have very strict development standards for what landscape looks like. And that's kind of where I was going about, how much, think about what you want the future landscape to look like, how much water, does that landscape need? And then that's what you should plan for.
Okay.
This data speaks very differently to me. What it tells me is that we need to make a serious effort in gray water. If we're going to make a significant impact, we need to catch as much of that water that's currently going down the sewer as we can and use that for outdoor irrigation. That seems to me to be the missing link here.
And rainwater. And rainwater
too. Absolutely.
What is lacking in the discussion is adding in new sources that are available, like that.
Yeah,
like cisterns. Yeah,
it's another way to reduce, residential use of Marin water, of public water,
Right.
by harvesting their own water on their property.
Well, I think that this is the purpose of the bigger study that we're doing here, which is to look at what are the ways to augment our supply. So I don't disagree, but I think there's probably a number of different things we want to look at objectively. I think that maybe, and I'm sure that
Monty, you can't, everything's interactive. Supply is interactive with conservation. And when you're talking about outdoor water use, I share Director Russell's sort of frustration with looking at it from just one perspective when we do have another perspective, another source, which is really wildly underused here in Marin. Gray water and rainwater capture is very underused in Marin, and we do have the statistics on that.
I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more, Larry.
I don't disagree. Larry, if you think I was disagreeing with you, I wasn't. I'm just merely saying that that reuse is, or rainwater capture is another form of supply, and I know that the bigger study that we are doing here is to look at all these as options. I'm not saying it shouldn't be looked at. I think it very much needs to be. We just need to see it in the context of other things. And I'm sure that this is probably not the only thing we're going to talk about tonight. So I just wonder if whether, I think we're all, and I'll share with Cynthia, I have a little hard time figuring that we can't do better than 1%. The number that just inherently does sort of seem like an incredibly small percentage. But so if there's some way that we can get some other data that from elsewhere that can help us to just test that. I'm not saying it's wrong and I'm not saying it's right, but I'm just saying if we could get maybe some other reference that helps us to compare that analysis a little bit, that might just help us to have the right amount of decision-based faith in these numbers, because we are trying to learn something here that we will make decisions around. And this is a really important thing to get right. That's all.
I think we're chasing the wrong dog here. Larry Bragman is exactly right. And when I moved here in '92, it was in the middle of a drought to Tiburon. And I looked seriously at putting in a cistern. And if you think about every country you've been in, a Mediterranean country, they all have cisterns, every single one of them. Greece, Italy, these are just routinely built into the houses. Istanbul has the one the Romans built. They were one the size of 2 football fields underground. And this is the place to really make some gain. I didn't build it because I calculated I needed 40,000 gallons, which is basically a good sized swimming pool underground, not above ground. So, I had to build it dig a hole. And I decided not to build it because of the cost. It was at that time, maybe $100,000. And, but I think Larry Bragman is exactly on the right track. We need to raise our eyes and look to the sky and stop looking at our feet. And I think that we need a redirection here on really looking for where the gains can be made.
Yeah, I mean, and I would just say, I think we may not necessarily redirect, but expand our look at the whole picture. And the other thing I remember at our last workshop, specifically requesting data from other districts to see what they're doing. And, I'm still not seeing it. I'm not seeing that data coming from the board or anywhere else. So, I'll repeat the request. I would like to see the data from other districts.
Well, I don't think it's up to the board to provide that. I mean, I think I sent around.
Well, if it's available to the board, I think it should be brought forth.
Well, I agree. Nobody's hiding anything there. And just to be clear, I'm not sure why this is being presented as a disagreement. I think Monty and I are on the same page as the two of you. Nobody's saying that this should be the only thing we're doing. So let's be very clear about that. No one is saying that this is the only thing we should be looking at. We're simply responding to this one piece of data and this one conclusion, which is that we're limited in what it seems to be saying, that we're very limited in what we can reasonably expect from efficiency from outdoor water use. I'm just finding it as, surprising. I don't think anybody's been a bigger proponent of gray water than me. So I'm right there with you. Cisterns, whatever. Obviously, reuse, those are all the options we should be looking at. I couldn't agree more. But again, I think it's a mistake to frame talking about efficiency as if it's something that precludes our doing other things. It's just, to me, a surprising conclusion. I appreciate it's the conclusion of the experts and we can move on. I'm not seeing the data to support it. And I think we should have that.
Yeah, I'm just, my query is, I'd like to see the alternative data.
Yeah.
And it's so far, it's been rather elusive.
I agree, but I'm not seeing the data to support this either, is the thing.
So Director Bragman, I do want to understand specifically what you're looking for with these comments. I take it you're interested to hear about some of the communities that have achieved far more reduction that are situated similar to us, meaning not at a starting point that had double the water usage, or bring that as well, right? So we can do that.
Yeah, and I'm not saying you guys have not or have failed to do that. I'm just saying our whole group, it's like, obviously we have a lot of access to data, and this is something that I think should be considered. That's all. And I understand what Peter was saying is where you're starting from a higher baseline, you're going to see greater reductions and that kind of thing. So I just would like to see.
But we can do that. We can bring case studies and talk about differences, similarities, and what folks have achieved.
Well, I think that Carrie's data analysis, let's just accept it. I don't disagree in my intuition about what Cynthia is saying, that it looks like it should be more, but let's just take the data as it is. And that's the point I was trying to get at, is that I think we're chasing the wrong dog here. I'm willing to accept Carrie's data analysis and just say, okay, I mean, 74 acre feet per year, it's hard to get excited from my standpoint. And I think we need to look where we can really make a bang for the buck.
You don't think it's hard to square that? That's all we could. The whole first part of the analysis was, this is our biggest opportunity And now we're being told, but it's really almost insignificant.
At the current level of investment.
Yeah.
That, I mean, what basically what we've assumed is the current level of investment where, and if that persists, this I think is what you're going to get, because that's kind of what you got in the past under a drought. That's what we're using as an understanding of what's achievable.
And isn't
And
that
that's
the
what
point? Isn't that the
that's
point?
what Carrie's saying.
The current
So you
level
can spend
of-
more, you know, if you want. You want to. So if you're trying to say on a different scenario, hey, let's be more aggressive and try to figure out a way to get more outdoor savings than is showing here. That would be possible, but that would have a different assumption for expenses than this
Right.
did.
And
That's exactly
Peter-
what, and the reason that it's surprising to me is because all of the other slides, now, but I mean, what was leading to this was, this is our single biggest conservation, efficiency. At least I thought that's what you were saying, Carrie, was that, and maybe Peter too, that this is the single biggest chunk of opportunity. We've invested very, very little in single family outdoor water use. We've done great on indoor. I'm hearing that. We've done great. 70% of the toilets apparently have been replaced. That's awesome. But it seems that we've done very, did I misunderstand? It seemed that you guys were both saying that that's the biggest opportunity, is outdoor residential water use.
It still is the biggest opportunity, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to slash it by 30 to 40%, which it sounds to me like is what you're talking about.
Oh, I'm not suggesting anything like, so let's be clear. That's not what I'm talking about, because now you've given people a soundbite that is false. So let me be very clear. To me, there's a big space between 1% and 40%.
Well,
right?
1% per year gets you to 10% after 10 years, and presumably could continue for 20 years. I mean, at some point it does level off.
Right.
But
it will
so
level
then,
off.
I mean, so it's a question of where you get to over what period of time, and
Right.
then maybe you could buy those percentages sooner. You could spend more money now and get it faster.
Right. I think that's all. I think that's really all I'm getting at, is that what you just said is what I'm agreeing with. So just to be clear, I did not use any of those percentages. They're not mine. Do not attribute those to me.
And that's fine. I think we should move on.
Yeah.
I think for now we've pounded this one. Let's finish the presentation, let the public speak, and then we can all kick in.
Okay.
Next slides are coming from Armin, so I'll turn it over to him.
Thanks, Carrie, and apologize for the frog voice this evening. I think the discussion actually was really good. I was trying not to interject because I think the discussion was good around where, what the existing levels of investment potentially could get you, what could an additional level of investment get you, and so I wanted to pull it back into how we're using that information in the assessment, the strategic water supply assessment. So just as a reminder, I know you've seen this slide several times in the past, but we're really looking to explore these future conditions and identifying, excuse me, what water supply futures we might have, what water demand futures we might have under different scenarios. And we're looking for, on the supply side, we're looking at, water supply conditions, climate change, drought variability, but on the demand side, we're also looking at what kinds of demand futures we might have. And so we're looking to create a set of scenarios that essentially capture the bounds or near the bounds of this envelope, this funnel that's being shown here. So we're not trying to capture everything on the funnel, but we want to have some cleverly crafted scenarios that at least get us to the range of uncertainties. If we go to the next slide, Paul. Yeah, thanks. So the main part of scenarios is to think about it as capturing uncertainty that's not directly in the management control of this particular decision. So we have two different areas where we look at potential actions. There's scenarios or things that happen largely out of our control, and then the management actions which are fully within the control. So when we think of water supply, we don't control hydroclimate. We don't the water supply or the climate projections. We don't really have a strong control on that. On the water demand, we have population and land use changes. We have things that are happening with passive levels of water use efficiency. and we can learn from the recent trends to help inform how that the direction of that movement. So if we go to the next one, so these are draft here, but we talked a little bit on the last workshop was about using scenarios, and we said somewhere on the order of 5 scenarios we would be crafting to help inform the study. We thought we'd share kind of early thinking on those 5 scenarios. Where the first one is what we would call kind of current trends. So again, we're exploring uncertainties that we don't specifically control. So the first one we would look at historical hydroclimate. So kind of what has been the last 100 years of water supply hydrology that we're looking at, climate, how that affects the water supply conditions. On the demand side, we would be looking at kind of a continuation of current trends in water use. So similar to what Carrie and Peter were just talking about, passive and continuing existing levels of investment. So we have scenario 1 looks at that and has a roughly 5% reduction in total GPCD out through 2045. So 2045 is the time horizon of the urban water management plan. So at this point, I've assumed that's the end point of our assessments. Scenario 2 would look at a higher pattern of accelerated reductions in water use, and we'd be looking at something on the order of about a 10% reduction in total GPCD by the end of that period at 2045. Again, we'd couple that with kind of historical hydroclimate. Then scenario 3, we'd start to explore the severities of drought. So kind of first scenario 3 is looking at a short and severe drought. So something like we've seen in the past 2-3 years now, really severe, short-lived, probably a 4-year drought is what we're crafting right now. So for some other work we've been doing in the region, we've taken the 2021, 2020, 2021, and then combined 1976 and 1977 on the back side of those two. So looking at what if you had a really severe, sharp 4-year drought. That's likely what we're going to be including in scenario 3. And then with that, we can couple that with either the scenario 1 demand assumptions or the scenario 2 demand assumptions. So we can look at higher levels of conservation or lower levels of conservation. Scenario 4 would be looking at a longer range, extended severe drought. So we might be looking at on the order of 6-year droughts. We've seen some of these out in the climate projections. We think they are quite challenging for the region and want to explore the risk associated with those droughts. And then finally, the scenario 5, we're still working through, but we wanted to look at abrupt disruption. So either, there's lots of different types of disruption. It could be, wildfire that contributes to a disruption in water supply or water quality changes. Could be Potter Valley project uncertainty on the Russian River system that reduces the potential availability of Sonoma water. Could be seismic issues or policy changes. So we're working through that one, but really want to explore these abrupt disruptions and how they might impact the reliability of the system. Okay, so those are the scenarios. So those are essentially things that are kind of external to the study. So things that would happen regardless, or we feel could happen regardless to the study. In terms of demand management options, focused on responding to improving reliability. So we would go beyond those scenarios. So Director Kohler, your comments earlier, if you had higher levels of investments, this is where we would explore them. So we are considering 3 different levels of demand management measures with different levels of investment. So we could be going well beyond those numbers that Carrie and Peter had presented earlier in this portion. This would be where we accelerate an investment, we get higher levels of adoption of certain programs. And then we would be comparing those measures on the same playing field as we would for water supply, as the water supply type projects that we're considering. So we have a level 1, 2, and 3. We're working through specific assumptions and numbers associated with those. So we hope to have that in the coming weeks, or maybe next week, in fact, where we would then propose or share those back with the board. Those will be higher than the numbers that were expressed earlier, but these are ones that would have a higher level of investment associated with them. They would also have kind of be more complex and potentially have different levels of certainty that they would achieve the outcome. But we wanted to look at it kind of in the same way we might look at a water supply option. I don't know if we should pause at that point or talk about, we have just a couple slides to wrap up on schedule and next steps. So.
Let's keep going.
You can keep rolling, yeah.
Okay. Paul, did you want to take these or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I'll finish this. This is the last couple slides. So just noting our schedule tonight, focus on demand management and some good conversations there. Coming up in 2 weeks' time, we'll be looking at drought scenarios and baseline reliability. And as I alluded to earlier, in the June work sessions, we'll be looking at the water supply alternatives in some detail and the evaluation process, which we sort of previewed 2 weeks ago as well. And noting that there are some additional public meetings we're hoping to schedule for May and June, just for general information around this project. So a lot of interesting discussion, notwithstanding on the exact numbers around what we think the savings potential is. I did want to just bring up and go back to that for a moment. And that is, if we were to combine both the indoor and outdoor savings that were looked at, about 120 acre feet per year, over 10 years, that cumulative savings would be about 6,600 acre feet. And if you were to average that cumulative savings over the 10 years, it's about 660 acre feet. So that starts to get into the 2% range for conservation. It's not intuitive, and we'll definitely bring the additional data that the board has requested back to help us understand where those numbers kind of reside. And as Armin just mentioned, that there'll be additional levels for the board to consider in terms of investment. But I would say along with that investment and the higher savings potential comes a measure of increased uncertainty in achieving those levels. So just wrapping up, as we saw tonight, the current residential demand is very low, and it's clearly a water shortage emergency and the response to that. And we don't really know and can't predict with any exactness the extent and rate of the rebound. And as Director Kohler was pointing out earlier, we wouldn't want to use these drought numbers just straight up for our water planning. So this does suggest, right, the use of some pre-drought average, whether it's the 3-year average or a 5-year average as the baseline for planning purposes going forward. Notwithstanding the discussions around potential for demand management savings measures that we could deploy in terms of scenarios. And then Armin just talked us briefly through how these scenarios could incorporate multiple different futures and lower demand in the form of higher conservation levels. And of course, other scenarios that would assume other water management actions, maybe supply sided. So we're going to continue to develop the data and bring scenarios and the alternatives back to the board and the public. And
Paul, could I ask one simple question on going back to the slide on the 17 to whatever it was, 35 acre feet a year. for conservation. Okay,
This one?
yeah.
Indoor, yeah.
So that number of the savings would be additive over a period of years. In other words, the following year, we would have a reduction of 52 to
That's right.
104 and so on, right?
That's
So
right.
that's how you're sort of
Yeah,
calculating the total savings. Okay.
that's right. Yeah. So, and we could see that historically too, when we look back from, I forget the period, Carrie, it might be 2009 to 2020 or something like that. We see, 13,000 acre feet of water that's been saved in that period of time. If you average it over that 10-year, you be forgiven for thinking that we actually saved 1,300 a year.
Right.
But that's not the case. It was this sort of, it's a bit like money in the bank and interest rates,
Right.
in that respect.
Right. But it may be possible to accelerate the rate of savings with additional investments is kind of the bottom line.
And maybe, yeah. And again, I would say, right, with additional interest rates comes additional risk.
Got it.
It's sort of I don't know if that's strictly true, in that perfect analogy sense, but it's how we're thinking about it at this point. And we'll try to find data that helps us in that regard.
This is really helpful. Thank you for that added clarity. And I think that this, there's two things I'm taking away from this, which is one is, these numbers, are in terms of their order of magnitude are important on a couple levels. One is that, that we need to have a sense of what we can achieve into the future realistically with current investments. And then I think also understanding what might be a maximum or something more if we increase our investment and there's a diminishing return, as we've talked about. I do think it also at the same time, this is not going to be our only solution. We've all said that. And I think that these order of magnitude numbers tell us that this is, this will probably be part of our solution set, but it is not the sole solution to what we, I think, are looking to achieve when we talk about trying to increase our supply that we have over that, where we're looking to increase it from our current levels of 2.5 years worth of supply to something larger. It is going to be more than conservation that's going to be needed to get there.
Agreed.
Okay, how about we listen to the public for a while?
Okay, President Russell, we have two members of the public who would like to speak. The first speaker is Mr. Roger Roberts, then Ed Jameson. Mr. Roberts, I've enabled you to speak, sir. Your speaking permissions, I mean. Go ahead, Mr. Roberts.
I have to unmute myself. At the end of the day, you're going to have a whole family of scenarios that call for different costs, not only on the supply side, but also on the demand side. And I'm very interested in the development of those cost figures, because that will drive, if you will, what you ultimately decide to do in terms of water rate necessities to meet the scenario that you choose, which will include a family of actions. So I would hope that as we move forward on this, we get a better handle on the cost side so that you can be prudent managers of the district in terms of its cost of service. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Jameson, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Loud and clear.
Thanks. I'll just start by saying the endless arguing I've seen tonight is really tedious, just as a sidelight. That key slide we talked about, you talked about on outdoor use reductions of 74 acre feet per year, that's 0.9% a year. In 10 years, that's 9% reduction on outdoor use. That strikes me as a very reasonable and hopeful, perhaps not achievable level to achieve over a period of 10 years. A 9% reduction, I think, is a reasonable objective and probably optimistic. As for asking for more data, we're already way below all the comparables. I don't understand the point if you really understand what we are comparing ourselves to. And other communities have not put in drip, and they've removed and not removed turf the way we have, as I have. That's part of why we're so far below almost everyone else. As for gray water, we've had several studies that have shown that there are nil opportunities for this paying off in any material way. It's truly insignificant. And if you're not a gardener, you don't know what you're talking about. You can't just put gray water into a drip system, for example, without treating it. And you have to have buried lines too. It's getting complicated. I know you're not interested, but it really won't achieve anything material. As for rainwater, President Russell, you've talked at least 3 times I've heard of saying how you really seriously looked into this. You were committed to achieving savings of water, and it was not financially practical. Ms. Kohler, on November 16th, in the context of your insisting that we cut GPCD by a stunning 52%, from 124 to 60 GPCD, later in that very meeting, you said Marin will have a different kind of, and I quote, landscaping that makes sense for Marin, end quote. You were very clear about that you have a very different vision for what Marin should look like. You're not Big Brother. Let us users make these decisions. And let this analytical plan process continue without tampering by non-objective board members. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We have 4 more speakers. The first one is Chance Cutrano. Go ahead, Chance.
Yes, greetings, staff, board of directors. Thanks for hearing me tonight. Chance Cutrano, Vice Mayor of Town of Fairfax, but I'm here speaking on behalf of myself. Yeah, I just want to commend y'all for sort of pushing on some of this and asking some tough questions. I think these workshops have been super helpful for me. I've been either live or watching the recordings, so thank you. And yeah, on the demand management stuff, it's really good to have that assumption come out that the stuff we're talking about is under the current level of investment, but under the varied scenarios, there are opportunities to get some diversity in terms of what accelerated upfront investment might look like to reduce some of the residential use. I also wanted to just note, I thought it was very valuable to hear about this idea of thinking about the amount of supply that we have and the landscape that we want to see or that we intend to see. And I think that's affected both by water futures, but also by climate futures. And I think that's a really compelling thing to think about, not only through this process, but at the tail end of this process for you all electeds to figure out. Because we might try to sustain a current business as usual scenario to the best of our abilities by enhancing our water supply via outside sources. But at the end of the day, I think we're affecting the surrounding environs, and there are a lot of possible externalities there. So I really hope you all consider those big questions as you ask for the detail in the weeds. And I appreciate both and appreciate all the work you're doing to date. And just know that the electeds are here to try to help you realize some of these visions and move quickly on this. It's something that we're talking about a lot still, even though we're uncertain of where we're going to be with the drought this year. But yeah, just keep us in mind in terms of collaboration moving forward so we can work on this together. Thank you all for all you do. Take care.
Thank you. The next speaker, Mr. Larry Minikes, and then 1402. Go ahead, Mr. Minikes.
Yes, good evening, folks. As Chancellor said, I think it's good that questions are being asked. Sometimes tough questions are being asked. I felt like you guys are more on the same page than it might appear this evening. There's just a little bit of talking past each other, but what I'm really getting out of this evening is the prudent approach is, what if we do have a 6-year drought, and how do we get through that 6-year drought? And that starts to bring up the larger questions that came from the last meeting, which are, do you look at indirect, direct portable reuse? Do we look at regional solutions such as Antioch, if we're really in 6 years, which means that the intertie might not be very valid, or that if we are in the intertie as well as these other options I just mentioned, it may not be able to supply what it's built for. So I really think that a range of options has to be considered if you work from the modeling that is being presented, which suggests what if we are in a 6-year drought, and likely a 3-year drought. That is not unlikely at all for us to see that in the next 10, 20, 30 years here. And I think with that, you have to mix in the very real possibility of a fire coming through some part of the watershed, and what will that do to supply? So to remain resilient, the conservation discussion tonight is part of this, but these larger investments are really where the big decisions are going to have to be made coming down the line. And with that, I thank you. Good evening.
Thank you. 1402 and then Gary Dennison. Go ahead, 1402.
James Holmes Larkspur. I think the quote of the evening was the consultant's statement that, quote, the sponge has already been squeezed, unquote. I detect palpable disappointment that the result for is not, that there isn't more opportunity for savings. But I think the board should follow the data even if it's disappointing. What the data indicates is that the opportunity for demand management, to use what I consider an Orwellian euphemism, is less than thought and hoped for, and that the district should focus on supply expansion, particularly increasing local reservoirs to capture rainfall when it comes, rather than demand management, i.e. squeezing the sponge more. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Gary Dennison and then Valerie Erickson. Go ahead, Mr. Dennison.
Yeah, Gary Dennison, Mill Valley, thank you. I have a question for Peter or Armin or anybody else that might know. Just, is there anything on a national level or a regional level that is trying to address the drought situation in the West? And like, I guess I'm thinking that we build pipelines to get gas and oil across the country, but is there any effort to build infrastructure to get water to the West from someplace else? That's my first question. And then my second was, I appreciated the 5 scenarios being given tonight. I'm still trying to understand within the context of those 5 scenarios, the purpose of the model and how the model is going to be used within those processes and using those things. So I think I don't know if I hope at some point there's going to be some public discussion on how the model is developed and how it's built, how it's going to be used, what its purpose is for. I would also like to know whether there's some type of independent validation of the model, or whether we're just going to take Marcelo's word for it that it works. I think there should be something independent of the developer that validates the model, that it is something that we can rely on if we're going to be using it. And then I assume that, again, with the model, he's going to be using some type of Monte Carlo simulation, and then we get into the confidence intervals, and all that's got to be discussions that has got to be held and discussed with the board, but I think the community at large has an interest in this. So, and finally, just data integrity of how do we know that the inputs into the model are the right inputs and sorry. So I would leave that, but my final comment of the evening is, and Director Kohler said this last week or at the last meeting, what is the end goal here? I still don't know what the end goal is going to be. Is that we're going to have enough water supply for, as a previous speaker mentioned, for a 6-year drought, or what? And when are we going to get to understand what that goal is? So that's my comments for this evening. So thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Dennison. The next two speakers are Valerie Erickson and then Michael Collette. Go ahead, Ms. Erickson.
Hi, this is Valerie Erickson. Oh, sorry. I appreciate everybody's efforts in the water conservation. I've got down pat. I practically use tablespoons of water to water a plant. But the thing is we have to think of other means to supply the water. I hadn't even thought of the watershed being burned out. And we don't want to be like Costa Rica where they get water at 9 a.m. and maybe at 9 p.m. What about other sources? What's being looked into with desalinization? There are 5 desalinization plants between here and Petaluma. The one in Petaluma doesn't use diffusion, so it's not as expensive. I just really think we got to think of other sources. Everyone I know is trying and everyone is complying. I got Scotch tape over my the handles on my toilets to make sure somebody doesn't forget. But at some point, we're really, I hate to, that we look out one day and there's just no water. What's being looked into with in regards to the desalinization plants?
Are you done, Ms. Collette?
Oh, that was me. That was not me. That was the previous speaker.
Oh, Ms. Erickson, are you done? Hello?
Hello? Hello?
Yes.
I'm here, Terry.
Okay, I just was, are you done with your comment, ma'am?
Well, my question is, what's being done looking into desalinization?
Oh,
I was just down in San Diego and they usually say, you know, leave a note if you don't want to change your sheets and leave your towels up in the rack if you don't want them to be washed. They've got desalinization now and you don't get those signs.
Well, we aren't responding to every comment, but we are taking them down and they'll be incorporated going forward. Be assured that desalinization is one of the number of water supply options that we will be looking at, and you'll be hearing all about the range of those at subsequent meetings.
thank you. I'm sorry. And then go ahead, Mr. Michael Collette. But after Mr. Michael Collette, we have Chuck Ballinger and Rick Edler. So go ahead, Mr. Collette.
Thank you. So first, I'd like to say that I'm impressed with the enormous complexity of the problem you guys are trying to solve. As a longtime San Rafael resident, I can say that I'm one of a number of people who are experiencing a certain growing resistance and hostility to having the sponge squeezed further. I've already invested a lot of money in a drip irrigation system. I'm an avid gardener. I really don't want to watch my garden die slowly as we try to figure this out. And yet, if we face a 6-year dire drought or fire in the watershed, I think I, like many, would let the plants die so we can all drink, right? That's clear. But what I don't think is appropriate is to constantly mine residential water use as a source of a solution to the problem. At some point, you have to be in the business of servicing the needs of the customers. And the needs of the customers include watering their plants. If people are willing to voluntarily be incentivized to pull their grass out, okay, that's fine. But on the other hand, maybe people really don't want to do that. They want their little patch of lawn as part of the American dream in suburban life, if it can be had. And I would really like to challenge the water district to think bigger. We seem to have spent many years in a demand side management of the equation. Clearly, this recent shock has opened up a new set of considerations around how to increase water supply, how to meet what might actually be a growing population, although those who forecast that seem not to be paying much attention to our local schools. Nonetheless, we should be looking at how to deliver a service. We should be looking at how to deliver a service at a reasonable price. And I think we should also be considering other sources of capital. We don't have to merely raise rates to fund expansions of dams. There's federal money available for infrastructure. And so there's possibly even a somewhat political solution to this. The country has built huge dams. It's had huge water projects over time. It's built railways, it's built freeways. It seems like now is a time to think about how to build a water system that meets the demands of the public, the needs of the public. And of course, then you have the basis to ask the public to respond when we're faced with actual crisis, right? So I do think the sponge has probably been squeezed more than you actually acknowledge, and that the public has got a deeper resistance to what you want to do next in terms of demand constraint than you actually realize. And I hear that all over my neighborhood. I live in East San Rafael. A lot of people are really quite aggravated. So Harbor, take note of the aggravation. Let's expand the system. Let's find a way to have resilience and meet the needs and interests and demands of the customers, rather than just focused on conservation, which I really applaud, but it has limits in terms of quality of life.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mr. Ballinger, please.
Yes, Chuck Ballinger from Mill Valley. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, I would also resonate that the sponge has been squeezed, captured a little bit more than I expected at this meeting. I think conservation is great. I have the plume. I got rid of my lawn. But I was hoping to hear more until Larry Russell and Larry Bragman spoke about gray water and rainwater. I became encouraged. I was up at Sulahuli this weekend looking at that reservoir, and I would love to hear more about the pipelines that are connected to Sulahuli. It's down about 16 to 18 feet currently from the spill water. And I think this is an opportunity at 2,000 acre feet per year that I would love to see the district move on. I know plans were made 3 or 4 years ago to raise this reservoir. I know that Walker Creek has different restrictions, if any, compared to the restrictions on Lagunitas. But I would love to get, maybe by calling Ben or Lucy, what the pipelines are in place for pumping up that reservoir, which could increase our water supply 25%. And by the way, I tuned in tonight because I thought the meeting would be a little bit more on water supply. I do applaud you guys for the Castaño pump station and also the Phoenix to Bon Tempe direct water line, which I think will help a lot. But again, I do agree with Peter Mayer. The sponge has been squeezed, so let's move on and look at some of these other options, including IPR, potentially DPR, and capturing rainwater. I live on a hill and I see acres and acres of water flowing down this hill going directly into the bay. I really think that in this day and age, we can figure out a way, whether they're cisterns or whatever, of capturing more of this water that is just like the Titanic sinking. We got to plug up these holes and capture the water. I see I have 1 minute, but that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Terry, before we move on, I wanted to speak to a broad comment of a number of the recent speakers that tonight was certainly a focus on demand management that allows us to project demand into the future. The vast majority of this project is scoped and we'll be looking at an array of water supply options. So this is not about demand management. It's really about long-term water resiliency. And of course, conservation demand management has a piece of that. But if you stay tuned to future meetings, you will see in-depth analysis on everything from desal to bringing water from Sonoma, potentially directly to reservoirs, interties, increasing local storage and more. So for folks that are just tuning into this meeting and feeling like the district is just looking at demand management or something, that's really not the case. And I think as we progress, you'll see the full spectrum of what this current effort is looking at and will be doing.
Well said, Ben. And I think it's important for folks to realize this is measure twice, cut once. That's what's going on here. This is not saying this is where we're going. It's just information for all of the users. We hear you loud and clear.
Thank you. Next two speakers, Rick Adler and then Mimi Willard. Go ahead, Mr. Adler.
Hello, thank you. I understand tonight is conservation. And so I'll stick to that, although I have an awful lot to say about supply. But that's for another day. I want to say I think you guys are doing a good job, rather excellent job, the board and the staff, except that for the times when you don't follow my suggestions. And so for the conservation, we got to realize that we are in one long drought. It's just going to get worse and worse. And the temperature is going to gradually rise. The plants are going to need more water. And then we'll have periodic things that we call a drought for a couple of years, more or less extreme. But gradually, it's one long drought. The climate's moving north. So eventually we're going to be like LA, have a climate like LA. And so we need to do all methods of supply and conservation. Even the smallest methods of conservation adds up. And so one thing that I found was missing in tonight's discussion was the outreach to the uneducated and uninterested members that use water, members of the community that use water. The way I figure it, about a quarter of the population is like the board and the staff and the people like me who call in, very interested in conservation and do every extra measure. You know, I collect rainwater, I use gray water. And about one quarter of the population is not community oriented, they're individually oriented, selfishly oriented, and they just don't give a damn about the rest of us. And so they just use whatever they want. And another quarter of the population just doesn't understand any of this. They don't even know you exist. And they just know that they turn on the water and the faucet and water always comes out. And then another quarter is maybe people that come in from out of the county to work here, and they use the water. They don't have a great interest in saving water here. So we need to increase education to reach all those people, to get all those people to get on board with the conservation. I don't know exactly how to do that, but that's what we should concentrate on, reaching out to all those people and get them all to participate the way you and I do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our last speaker is Mimi Willard. Go ahead, Miss Willard.
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think that what we heard tonight is that secularly, point to point, we've done a pretty good job here in Marin, but that we're maybe getting to somewhat diminishing returns in terms of conservation as we've been doing it. And that I think we've also heard a number of comments tonight. Michael Collette said it well, that there's starting to be exhaustion and perhaps some pushback, and probably the pushback in part comes from the series of maybe appropriate or not drought regulations that I think we're successful in the moment, but that ultimately cause some people to feel that they're being micromanaged, and they get exhausted with that and they push back against that. And we're probably, in the ninth inning of that phenomenon. So at this point, it seems to me that the next step in demand management is one that Director Kohler and others have talked about, which is to move to smart meters, the AMI approach, in which case you can, of course, detect leaks more readily, but you can also detect people who are violating whatever rules have been set up about what time of day you can use water and what you can use it for, etc. And I think that this is potentially really a big hot potato, because if you move, I think that the problem is that if people perceive the perspective to be spied on through their meters, then they are not going to be keen to have those sophisticated meters installed, even if they would help detect leaks. So I think you have a an issue there to address, and we'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ms. Willard. I have no further speakers.
Okay. Any other comments from the board?
I sort of have just one kind of maybe a wrap up, Larry, if everybody else is done.
Sure.
So I think a lot of the conversation, I want to thank the staff and the consultants who are with us tonight. I think it was a great presentation. I think there was a lot of great information. I'm sorry the scenarios went by kind of fast. I think we all need time to absorb those. But I think the important takeaway from tonight, at least from my perspective, is that there is zero possibility that Marin Water will be looking at an efficiency only approach. And in fact, this is not even, as we saw, one of the scenarios on the table. The much more likely challenge is that we will fail to avail ourselves of the least expensive and most effective low-hanging opportunities on the efficiency side that really should be the foundation of a supplemental water supply strategy, because we're understating the opportunity. That would be a tragedy for the ratepayers. No one, myself included, wants to push harder on people who've invested in the efficient use of water, as someone, certainly my family has done so. And I appreciate the frustration of those who don't want to see residential being mined, as I think one of the commenters just put it. The challenge is the very large number of consumers who have not moved or attempted to be more efficient to make even minor challenges. If you spent any time with water news in the last month or two or year, you'll be aware that there are communities statewide that are suffering, really suffering far more than we are, in no small part because of their limited willingness to invest in readily available, affordable water tech and efficiency. The purpose of this water assessment that we're all talking about here is fundamentally, at the bottom line, is to invest in new supplemental supply. I don't hear anybody on the board, certainly not me, feeling differently, as Ben has indicated. There's no question that the district will be making these investments. The question is going to be at what cost and to whom. So the fiduciary obligation that we have is not only to invest in secure, safe supply, but to be able to do so at a reasonable cost, affordable to everyone. So that means we need to avail ourselves of reasonably affordable opportunities. So I just want to leave people with that thought, and to underscore what Ben just said, and I appreciated Ben, that tonight was about demand management. That doesn't mean the entire supply assessment is. So at the end of the day, we're going to be investing in new supplemental supply. All of us are there. There's no question about it. The issue is really going to be, what's that going to be, and what is the goal that we're trying to reach? So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Okay, hearing no other comments, I think we're going to bring the meeting to a close.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody, and thanks very much to the presenters. I found the information very interesting, and I think the public did too.
Thanks a lot, you guys.